Alright, so sorry about the boring background. I was going to film with my nice like bookshelf aesthetic-y background, but the sun was just blasting in that area, and I didn't want to wait for the sun to go away. So this is the prison cell looking background that we've got. So the most consistent thing about me has always been that I can use the amount that I am reading as a very reliable litmus test for my mental health. If I'm not reading that much, that usually means I'm doing pretty good. I'm probably writing or going outside, being with friends, just doing other things instead. But when I'm reading a lot, that means I'm doing not so well. I read one book last year. We are in March of this year, and so far I've read 13. So that's where we're at. My anxiety has been playing me like a fiddle for the past 7 months. I'm basically trying to take this thing, this head of mine, and just plop it into a book so that it cannot have an independent thought, because when it does, it's bad. So that's what I've been doing for the past little bit. For the few people that are subscribed to my channel and have actually watched all my videos and all that, I did try to make a video during the last little bit. So it's not like I've just not been doing that. I actually filmed a video in November, and I was really proud of myself because I filmed it post panic attack and pre-panic attack. Just in a panic attack sandwich, I filmed this video, and I was really proud of it. I was like, they can't even tell. I thought there was going to be an Oscar coming my way. I honestly did. And I went through the process of editing that footage. I did it all. We were all ready to go with this video, and then something happened with the audio, and I'm still not sure what, but all of it was just distorted, and I could not fix it. And after sinking just hours and hours of my life into this video, I eventually just had to bid it adieu because it was just not working. And yeah, I'm planning on refilming at some point. I just never got around to it. So that is the beautiful space that I am coming to you from today. Basically the deep dark pits of hell. As I've been reading a lot, I've also been watching a lot of booktuber videos, and just a couple days ago it hit me that I have read 13 books, and I do have things to say about them, and may as well sit down and talk about them. This video is not scripted like most of my videos are, but I do have some notes written out so that I don't just go on a tangent the entire time. So if you see me looking down at any of these notes, just know it's for your good as much as it is mine, because as my family and all my close friends will tell me, summarizing is just not something I'm good at, and I need to have, something to stick to. Okay, so enough complaining. Let's get into the books that I have read from January to now. So the first book that I read this year was Allegedly by Tiffany D. Jackson. Basically, the story follows a girl named Mary B. Addison who, when she was a kid, I think she was 9, was convicted of killing a white baby. At the time that the story takes place, Mary is 15 and living in a group home and is also pregnant, which is super fun. Readers are basically following Mary's journey as she kind of fights to prove her innocence from when she was a child so that she can then keep her unborn child. Needless to say, it gets pretty dark. I mostly picked this book up because I've been wanting to get into Tiffany D. Jackson's books for a while, and this seemed like a good starting point. While I am in no way dissuading anyone from picking this book up because it is a good book, I will say, maybe don't read this if you are in a vulnerable state. I would maybe suggest reading it when it's daytime and you can walk out of your room and talk to a person after you finish reading, because I didn't do that. I finished this book at 3 in the morning and there was nobody to talk to because all of my roommates were asleep, and I just kind of sat there and stared at a wall and slowly felt just my whole brain dissolve. That's basically what happened. If you're interested in reading that book based on the premise, I would skip past the next little bit of this video because I'm going to completely spoil the end of the book. So 3, 2, 1, be gone.
So I didn't like how my explanation came out in the footage that I had, so here I am 3 months after the fact to re-explain. This book essentially presents itself as one thing, and then in the last 2 pages throttles you with new information that challenges your perception of the entire book and the protagonist. Needless to say, this last second reveal has been pretty controversial. Some people love it, some people hate it. I myself kind of decided that I wouldn't know how I felt about the ending until I reread the book, because I have to kind of see if there were hints along the way, because I do think without the hints along the way, the ending is just kind of cheap and stupid. But if they were able to foreshadow it well, then I think it's really cool. It all just depends on how I feel when I reread it. But due to the difficult subject matter and just the general intensity of the book, I won't be rereading anytime soon, and until then my review is just going to stay at 4 stars. I don't really imagine that rereading is going to make me increase the rating, because, I'm pretty selective when it comes to giving books 5 stars, but depending on how I think the twist is executed after a reread, I may lower the rating to 3 stars. So do with that information what you will. I think it's a worthwhile read either way, and honestly, I do think that rereading will give me a higher opinion rather than a lower opinion, but I just don't know until I do that, and that's not going to be for a very long time.
I ultimately gave this book 4 stars, and once again, I do recommend it. Just be aware of your own limits with that. So the next book I actually have a copy of because I purchased it with my Christmas money. That is Eleanor, Oliphant is Completely Fine. With this book, I think most people probably already know about it. Reese Witherspoon, she's a fan. But for those of you who don't know, it's basically about a woman in her 30s who is trapped in this lonely and mundane routine, but she stumbles upon this man and decides that he is just going to be the perfect match for her, and from that point on, she makes it her just life mission to basically form a relationship out of thin air. And through this plan, she ends up needing to process a lot of the things that happened in her past, and for those of you that have read this book, you know that her past is a bit of a doozy. I added this to my TBR back in December of 2018, which I believe is roughly around when it came out. Oh, this came out in 2017, so I was behind the curve even then. I would read this if you enjoy contemporary that has a bit of, for lack of a better term, meat to it. Also, if you're looking for a main character to really root for and get behind. I'd also read this if you enjoy watching relationships kind of form and evolve over the course of 300 pages. I gave this one 4 stars as well. For my first February read, I read Sal by Mick Kitson. Sal follows a 13-year-old girl named Sal who has decided to run away with her 10-year-old sister from her alcoholic mom and her abusive stepdad. And they decide that they're going to make do, kind of like Bear Grylls style, in the Scottish wilderness. I would recommend this book if you want to see a fresh take on kind of your typical survival story. It is nice to see a young female protagonist in this role. I would also recommend this if you're interested in snatches of historical fiction thrown into your books. This book spends a lot of time talking about a side character's experiences during the Cold War, I think it was. It's been a while since I read this book, and it honestly didn't stick with me that much. Honestly, for me, this book was kind of underwhelming. There was nothing really wrong with it. I don't have anything negative to say. I just kept waiting for it to, just step up a level and, really, punch me in the gut or grab me by the throat or just, anything. And it never really did that for me. Part of it I do think is because I had just read Allegedly and Eleanor Oliphant, which are very hard-hitting books, and this one just wasn't as much. I ultimately gave it 3 stars because, like I said, nothing wrong with it, just kind of okay. The next book I read, I finished on February 10th, and it is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kiersten White. This is basically a feminist retelling of the Frankenstein story, but through the perspective of the ill-fated wife of Victor Frankenstein, Elizabeth. I bought this years ago, mostly because I really liked the pink cover, and I'm a big fan of stories with conniving female protagonists in, let's say, questionable relationships. I found this book really enjoyable, mostly because it's so like delightfully aesthetic and just generally creepy. It offered a great sense of escapism, which I can't really say the same for any of the previous books. This one honestly kind of ticked off the box of just like, I picked it up and the world around me just went away. Oh, that sounds so cheesy. Moving into kind of spoiler territory, the book does end on kind of a found family note, which, like, I'm not mad about it. Like, I'll always be down for that trope. But I was really enjoying just how, like, dark and creepy we were getting, and I kind of wanted to just, like, go full speed ahead in that direction. I didn't necessarily feel the need to just kind of suddenly be friends and go live in, like, I don't know, they end up in, like, the wilderness somewhere, I don't know. But I ended on 4 stars for this one. I did really enjoy it, and I would recommend it if any of this sounded interesting to you. Also, the cover is just, like, so pink. So the next book on the list is A Declaration of the Rights of Magicians by HG Parry. I finished this book on February 23rd. It took me quite a while to read because it's pretty chunky. It's almost 600 pages, I'm pretty sure. Basically, it's historical fiction meets fantasy during the Age of Enlightenment, and we jump from England to Jamaica / Haiti and also France, and we have like a different batch of characters for each location. Basically, the idea is everything historically is the same, except there's magic now, and we've got, like, vampires and all the magic things. I would recommend this book if you have patience. I tried really hard to be fair with this book because I added it on a whim to a library haul, and honestly, I knew going into it that it was going to be a bit of an uphill battle with me because I don't really like fantasy, and historical fiction can be good, but it's not like my go-to either. There were parts of this book that I found pretty engaging, pretty much everything to do with France. I mean, it's the French Revolution, there's guillotines, it's a fun time. But beyond that, I wasn't super impressed. Of the two genres, I vastly prefer historical fiction to fantasy, but this book took all of the worst elements of historical fiction and just, like, amplified them to, like, 300 until it was just so... I was, like, just, like, begging, like, can we go back to the vampires? I don't even like vampires, but, like, I want to see them again so that something happens. Whenever we were in, like, historical fiction zone, it was just talking and more talking. And, like, not even... I'm fine with books where it's just people talking. I honestly am. But you need to have a different conversation each time. It was just the same couple of characters just repeating the same thing over and over and over again. And, like, every conversation we would get, like, a shred of, like, new information or just one thing that was different. We never had any, like, fights between these people. We never had any, like, major conflict. It was just, like, respectfully, I agree with you. And just back and forth over and over and over again. We also kind of, at times, dabbled in the white savior trope a bit, at times. Unintentionally on the author's part. I'm sure that they did not mean to do this. Just based on the plot of the book, it kind of just emerged, and in a way I kind of feel bad for them because I know they didn't mean to do that, but also just like, you know. I ended up giving this book 2 stars, mostly because I respect what it was trying to do. But it didn't do it for me, and honestly, I think that there's better books to read, so I wouldn't waste my time on this one. The next book was Being Fishkill by Ruth Lehrer. This I read in one day on February 26th. It is a kind of middle grade, but probably leaning a little bit more YA novel about a girl named Fishkill Carmel who was raised in a situation with lots of poverty and neglect, and she ends up meeting this girl in her grade named Duck Duck, these are their real names, and basically gets to experience a family for a little while. That's all I'll say. I wanted to read this book for forever because it has rave reviews. People just adore this book. I think it has like an average of like 4.36 on Goodreads, which is really good. And then not only does it have a high average rating, if you go to the page, like, every review is like 5 stars. Everyone like, I cried, it was stunning, it was gorgeous, beautiful, love it. So I added it to my TBR once again, like, years ago, back in like December of 2018. And man, what a letdown. I will say, if you are somebody that really enjoys themes of like grief and trauma as told through the eyes of a young protagonist, I think you probably would like it. I think for me, the biggest issue was that I saw just heaps and heaps of praise for this book, like, before I opened it, and that kind of put my expectations up here, when really my expectations should have just been, like, I don't know, here. I will say I did read this from cover to cover in one sitting, in one night, but I do think that was more to do with the fact that I knew if I stopped reading, I wouldn't want to pick it back up. So it's not like it's a bad book, but my big issue with it was that the protagonist, who is supposed to be like 12, reads as though she's about 10, and it just made it really, really hard for me to get into the world. There's a lot of swearing and a lot of just generally derogatory language that's used by the 12-year-olds, and I kind of felt like the author was trying to almost use that as like a, hey look, they're swearing, they're using all of these derogatory terms. Clearly, they're 12. But I didn't really buy that because 10-year-olds say all of the same things. And huge, huge spoiler, a big plot point of the book is that Duck Duck dies. And I gotta be real, I kind of hated her, so it wasn't that big of a gut punch for me. Like, I did cry, but mostly because everybody else in the book was crying, and I'm an easy target. I'll cry at just about anything.
So, a little editing aside here. It's now been 3 months since I've read this book, and I think I've finally figured out why it didn't sit right with me. And it's because it's a middle grade book that's written for adults and not for kids. And I have to say, the reviews in the book really do prove that. There is not a kid in sight in the reviews, and I know that kids are on Goodreads because I've seen them before. They are just not reading this book. And I do realize that as like a 20-something, like, I'm not really in either demographic, so neither are really for me. But when I think about all of the middle grade that I've enjoyed throughout my life, like Walk to Moons, Holes, The Thing About Jellyfish, while all of them definitely have crossover appeal and definitely can be read by adults because they're fantastic books, they had to first and foremost appeal to kids. And kids are by far the pickiest demographic when it comes to reading, and also just in general, kids are super picky. I think we all remember being like 10 and hating everything in life. And while middle grade authors have that task of trying to nail down the most difficult demographic, they have to be super inventive and engaging and almost addicting. They have to have this like addictive quality to keep kids reading, and that's what I've found in every single like 5-star middle grade book that I've ever read. And being Fishkill made me realize that I am just not a fan of middle grade books that are meant for adults because they don't have that same like lovable quirkiness to them that really pulls you in. So to conclude this little side note, Being Fishkill is not a book that kids can enjoy, and because of that, it's not really a book that I can enjoy because the qualities that I look for in middle grade are the qualities that are keeping kids reading. And this book was meant to keep adults reading, and when it comes to just, you know, an adult book but told through the eyes of a child, it's just not as interesting to me as the typical middle grade genre.
I just really did not get the hype on this one. I gave it 3 stars. The next book, which I finished on February 28th, was Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I read this for school, and my policy on rating books that I had to read for school is usually, if I decide that I would have kept reading it had the school assignment just kind of gone away, then I will rate it. But if throughout the entire book the only thing that is keeping me reading is the fact that I have to be reading it, then I just won't rate the book because I didn't really pick it up voluntarily. And yeah, I would have stopped reading if not for school, I think. I don't know. Moving into March, I read Words in Deep Blue by Cath Crowley. This was my first 1-star of the year. It's a YA contemporary, and it's basically just a friends to lovers trope set against the backdrop of a bookshop, and there's a little bit of grief thrown in to spice things up, and lots of unnecessary side romances. I read this book's premise on Goodreads a long time ago and thought, you know, it seems a little bit basic, but I'm willing to give it a shot because it has a like 4.07 on Goodreads, and for YA Contemporary, that's a really good average rating, and I was like, okay, well, yeah, it seems like it's a bit of a basic kind of, you know, dare I say it, fanficky premise, but you know, everybody really likes it, so clearly this author did something right. I felt a little bit conflicted when I tried to rate this one because I started out totally on board. I was like, yes, we're in a bookshop, we are... What even happens in this book? Initially, I was having a good time, but by the end of the book, I was rolling my eyes at every single sentence, so I couldn't really rate it any higher than a 2-star, and honestly, I probably should have rated it 2 stars. I usually reserve 1-star reviews for books that, like, were really, really bad, but this just has such a high overall rating that I feel like it's my responsibility to pull it down a little bit, because other people are gonna go into this thinking like, oh, well, yeah, the premise is a little basic, but people seem to really like it. I didn't. There's not really a whole lot to say other than just the characters are irritating, and in the beginning I was kind of rolling with it because I was like, okay, these, you know, irritating attributes can be kind of endearing at times, I suppose, but they didn't get endearing, they just got worse. And a big draw for this book for lots and lots of people, as I saw on Goodreads, is the fact that it's set in a bookstore. And people just found that to be a really romantic setting, which I get. Bookstores are great. That said, I've noticed that I really hate people in books that talk about books. They always, without fail, come off as so pretentious and obnoxious. Every time there's a protagonist whose whole personality is like, oh, I love books, it's always just like, I think it's probably the fact that it's only ever like classics that get mentioned and that makes them seem pretentious. I don't know. I really don't think I have ever experienced a like bookish protagonist that I've enjoyed. They're all just so unbelievably irritating and pretentious, and yeah, that's basically what this book is. I will say though, I can't 100% blame the overall rating for bamboozling me, because if I had just scrolled down to the very first 5-star review, I would have seen this reviewer say, I haven't cried this hard since Me Before You and All the Bright Places. 2 books that I personally do not vibe with. And then I would have just known. This is the type of crowd that this book is attracting. People that liked Me Before You and All the Bright Places. Probably 13 Reasons Why on top of that. Just, I should have known. I would have saved myself a lot of headaches. But I didn't do that. That's on me. I don't understand why people love this book so much. It's really not good. But in all fairness, I also don't understand why people like Me Before You and All the Bright Places so much, so. The next book that I read was The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. I read this book on March 7th. I initially rated this book 5 stars, mostly because I was A, so excited to not be reading Words in Deep Blue anymore, and B, because I really wanted to have a 5-star read in like the first couple of months of the year, but I ended up bringing it back down to 4 stars. This book is about a girl whose mother was a known witch, and she is herself living in a puritanical society, and you can probably assume that witchy, witchcrafty things ensue. I follow this author on Twitter, which is why I knew about this book. I think the cover is beautiful, and even though I'm not one of those people that gets like super into like witchy storylines, I know for some people it's like their lifeblood. I've never been opposed to it, it's just not a genre that like grabs me necessarily. But if you like witches and you really like dark and gory things, I would definitely recommend this book. It was really engrossing and aesthetically pleasing. I would honestly compare it to The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. They're kind of on the same level for me. I think that the pacing and plotting of The Year of the Witching was better, and I liked the characterization of Elizabeth Frankenstein better. The characterization was ultimately what made me put it down to 4 stars rather than 5. After having like some space from the book and being able to like process everything I'd read, I kind of was like, you know what, I did really enjoy that, but like honestly, for the characterization, I'd give it like a 6 out of 10. And like, for me, characterization is really important. So yeah, that one ended up being a 4 out of 5. I would definitely recommend it, and I can definitely see myself reaching for another Alexis Henderson book in the future. The next book was We Were Restless Things by Cole Nagamatsu. I read that on March 17th in the middle of finals week. This book was a YA, like, contemporary with a pinch of like fantasy, thriller, all that. It's basically following a group of teens after the death of a boy named Link, who died by drowning on dry land. How did that happen? Yeah, so basically I picked this up in Barnes & Noble over winter break, the same time that I bought Eleanor Oliphant, and I really loved the cover. The cover is beautiful, and the premise, I was like, okay, all right, interesting. And I think I even like flipped through it and like decided that I liked the writing style enough to want to read it, but it was quite expensive and I only had a little bit on my gift card. So I actually requested it through my library, and they accepted my request. I love my library so much. I just want to throw that in there. They've accepted every request that I've put in, and they're just wonderful, and I adore them. And I requested this even after noticing that the overall Goodreads score for this book was quite low. I think it was like a 3.2 something. So yeah, not great, below average. I, went through a couple of those reviews to see why people were disliking it, to see if there was anything like majorly problematic about this book. And it didn't seem like that was the case. Everyone was just saying this is so slow and boring and character driven. And I was like, you know what? I'm okay with things being slow and boring and character driven. I'm fine with that. I want to read this book anyway. So I went into it knowing that it would be really slow and it would take a lot of patience. And I would read this book if you really like character driven stories. Also, if you are looking for some asexual representation, there is that.
So, quick note on the ace rep. I've seen quite a few split opinions on the representation in this book, and I'm not someone that feels qualified to give something a good or bad representation sticker. I mean, granted, asexuality is a spectrum, and this whole thing is by no means a binary issue, but because some people have praised this book and others have deemed it problematic for its depiction of asexuality, I would encourage people to do their own research into this book if they were worried about some of the depictions of it. I'm not endorsing this book as a perfect blanket representation for asexuality, but there is an asexual main character, and asexuality is talked about a lot in this book, so representation exists. Whether it's good or bad, I don't really feel like that's up to me, so I would definitely see what other reviewers have to say if this is a book that is interesting you for that element.
The thing with this book is that literally everything was in this book's favor. I had been the one to request it from the library, so I had kind of this sense of obligation, like I made my library buy this book for me. I wanted to like it. I had read the reviews beforehand and knew that a lot of people didn't like it and that it was going to be slow and very character driven, so I went in with a bit of a warning. And I also was reading it in the middle of finals week, so every time that I picked it up, which was not very often because I was really, really busy, I was just so happy to be reading it because I was so glad to not be doing final stuff. But it's just not that good. The writing itself is honestly lovely. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And I did like how character-driven it was. I liked that I learned a lot about the characters, but I just don't understand how this book didn't get hit with more edits before getting published, because it really needed it. And I'm not just meaning that in the sense of things needed to get cut out, although they certainly did. I mostly mean it in just there were so many opportunities to put tension into the story, and they just were not taken, and it just, I completely understand why so many people stopped reading, because just not a whole lot happens in the first, I can't even really give a number, because honestly it kind of feels like nothing happens. I know that's not true, there are moments in this book that are really, really good. And I will say there was one night that I sat down to read this book thinking that I'd read for like an hour before going to bed. I ended up reading for like 5 hours. So, you know, it's doing something right at some points, but it just needed some help. I don't think it was ready to be published. I gave it 2 stars. Honestly, I wish this book the best, and I hope that its Goodreads rating goes up a little bit, but I'm not gonna say that it's undeserving of that rating. So there's that. After finishing We Were Restless Things, I was on spring break, and I basically just read the entire time. The first book that I read was 8 Perfect Murders by Peter Swanson, which I finished on March 20th, and I read this cover to cover in a day. The basic plot of this book is that there is somebody who is copying perfect murders in literature. I had really, really low expectations for this book, mostly because when it comes to the thriller genre, I tend to stay away from male authors, mostly because in a lot of books there tends to be a dollop of the male gaze, and when it comes to like the thriller genre where there's a lot of like women being brutalized, I tend to just not vibe with that. So yeah, I didn't have high hopes for this one, but I was totally surprised. I would say that if you go into thrillers really hoping to be surprised by twists that you didn't see coming, this is a great book for that. After reading this book, you also get to learn a lot about some classic crime fiction. The earliest, I believe, is in the 1920s, and the latest is Donna Tart's The Secret History, which is from, I believe, 92. And, like, yes, there was a little bit of the male gaze, particularly coming up in the fact that, like, every woman in this book, besides, like, one who doesn't really have an important role, they all, at some point, are infatuated with the male protagonist, which just was a little bit irritating. But with so much else going on, it was pretty easy to overlook. The one thing I would say if you do end up reading this book is you'll have to, like, suspend your disbelief for, like, the first 2 chapters, but once you get past there, you know, it's easy to just eat this book up. So I gave it 4 stars, and I might actually end up reading more from Peter Swanson because this was pretty good. The next book was The Wildlands by Abby Jenny, I think is how you say her last name, or Jeannie. I read this on March 23rd, well, finished it on March 23rd. It took me only 2 days, and it's not super long, but it is fairly dense text. Basically, a tornado totally destroys a family's home and kills their last remaining parent, leaving their 19-year-old sister to watch over the family. And 3 years after that tragic event, we see that one of the family members has resorted to a life of eco-terrorism. Yeah, that's basically the book. The reason I picked up this book is because I actually own Abby Jenny's debut. I bought it at the end of last year at a used bookstore. It's called The Lightkeepers, and I gave it 2 stars because I didn't have a good time with some of the decisions that were made in terms of plot, but the writing in that book is just amazing. It's like, I genuinely want this woman to just teach me how to write, because if I could write like her, I would want for nothing else. So I really, really wanted to read another book of hers because I was like, you know what, if you can like give me a plot that I can really get behind, combine it with your writing, like it'll be a 5-star book, no contest. So I would recommend this book if you just really love reading for writing. Definitely grab this one or The Lightkeepers, because both of them are just amazingly beautifully written. I would also read this book if you enjoy books about siblings and also animals. Animals play a big role in this book, and combined with Abby Jenny's just fantastic writing, that aspect of the book is just a delight to read. I ended up giving this book 3 stars, which, you know, a little bit sad that I didn't like it more. As I have mentioned many times while talking about this book now, I loved the writing. We can go ahead and insert Lady Gaga now.
Talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular, never the same.
But I thought that the book could have used a stronger sense of urgency to kind of pull all of the elements together. Like, there's nothing really wrong with the book. I didn't love the ending, but there's honestly nothing that's like wrong with the book. It just needed just a sense of urgency to really like propel the story forward, I felt like, and it was missing that, which just made for a good read, but nothing astounding. And moving into the last book of so far 2021, is that the year? Yeah, 2021. I finished Devolution by Max Brooks on March 27th. It took me a while to finish this one, even though it's not that long and honestly not hard to read at all. I just, after like a couple days of just straight reading, I got a little bit distracted. Basically, the premise of this book is Bigfoot. This book is about Bigfoot, and I don't really feel like I need to give more of a synopsis there. That's what it's about. It's about Bigfoot. The reason I found this book was because I watched this like hour-and-a-half video. Basically, the video was going over the Goodreads horror picks for 2020, and this was on the list, and Kayla, I remember in the video, said that she didn't like this book. I just remembered thinking, like, you know what, I really don't care if nobody else liked it. I have to try it because it's Bigfoot. I'm going to give Bigfoot a chance. So I basically just ignored the negative review and got this book anyway. I would recommend this book if you like fiction that is playing dress up as nonfiction. Similar to World War Z, or so I've heard, because I've never read it. It's basically told through a combination of like a journal entry and then also different like interviews from various Bigfoot experts. And yeah, once again, if you like Bigfoot, that's what this is about. How many times can I say Bigfoot while reviewing this book? This book basically made me realize that an author can get away with a lot if they just bring Bigfoot in. Because honestly, there was a lot wrong with this book. It's not that good on a technical level. However, Bigfoot. As I was reading, I was kind of wondering if I maybe was a little bit biased because I live in Washington State, and as I was reading this, it kind of hit me like, you know, I know that Bigfoot is like known everywhere, like everyone knows about it, but like, I think that Washington is, like, kind of the place. Like, I literally drive past, like, signs that have, like, Bigfoot on them, like, when I go to my apartment. Like, it's everywhere. Like, Bigfoot is a mythical figure that is very much rooted in, like, Washington State history. And so I, at times, was thinking, like, is this a me problem? Is this just, like, me that's really into this? And, like, other people probably hate it because they're like, I'm not like connected to this whole like universe. I don't know. It's also set in Washington State. It's set, I don't know why I'm pointing to that. You can't read it. It's set near Mount Rainier, which is a beautiful mountain, and it's my mountain because it's close to where I live. And I definitely think that the location combined with just all of the like Washington specific folklore really saved this book on a lot of accounts because, as I said, there's a lot wrong with this book. I found the protagonist's voice to be incredibly irritating. I also did not really care for a lot of the action sequences because it kind of felt like they were meant to be in a movie rather than in a book. I felt like the author was basically telling me like, well, you had to be there. And I'm like, well, I'm not. And it's your job to like tell me so that I think that I am there. Also, I'm not a big fan of when there's like some, now I have to say this word. I can type it out. Anthropomorphism. Just whenever animals or monsters or whatever are like given human traits, I'm never a fan of that. I find that it just dulls the tension every time. And, you know, there's a little bit of that going on in this. And I didn't love that aspect of the book. But I ended up giving it 3 stars despite its flaws just because Bigfoot. Also, You mentioned my home state like a lot, and I really appreciated that. And that is the end of the video. There's lots of reading ahead for me, and if I am at a point where I feel like I don't have the mental capacity to actually script a video, and I would rather just sit in front of the camera and talk about books that I read, maybe I'll do another one of these videos, because yeah, it's kind of fun. I like talking about books, and everyone in my life is tired of hearing about the books I'm reading, so we gotta go to the internet. Basically, as long as I'm feeling mentally just unwell, I will be consuming books at a rapid pace. And honestly, I am making it a goal to like actually change that about myself. Like, I want to read as somebody that feels stable and happy as well. I think that would really change the experience for me. And on that note, thank you so much for watching. I don't know how long this video is going to be. Probably very long. I talked for a long time. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you when I see you. Potentially after I've read another like 13 books, who knows. This tea's been cold for a very long time, but it's still good.